To understand why Moses wrote as he did, we must first look into the background of the literary traditions that existed in his day. The literature of the ancient Near East is very important to our purposes, first because other primeval accounts were widely available to Moses, and second, because Moses actually interacted with other primeval accounts. Archaeological research has demonstrated that Moses was not the first person to write about the world's origins. To be sure, God inspired Moses so that his account is true. But Moses wrote in a day when many nations and groups in the Near East had already written many myths and epics about primeval history. Some of these ancient texts are well known. Many people have heard of things like the Enuma Elish, or the Babylonian creation story, or Tablet 11 of the Gilgamesh epic, or the Babylonian flood story. An assortment of primeval accounts were written in Egypt and Canaan as well. These and many other documents from the ancient world dealt with the origins and early history of the universe. And not only that, but many of these ancient Near Eastern documents were actually available to Moses in his youth. Moses was educated in the royal courts of Egypt, and his writings indicate that he knew the literature of the ancient world. As Moses wrote his own divinely inspired and true account of the primeval period, he was quite aware of other literary traditions in the ancient Near East. Knowing that other primeval accounts were available to Moses, we're now in a position to ask another question. How did Moses interact with the myths and epics of other cultures? As we'll see throughout this series of lessons, Moses interacted with other primeval traditions both negatively and positively. On the one hand, Moses wrote his history of the early times to counter falsehood with truth. We must always remember that the Israelites Moses led had been subjected to all kinds of pagan influence. They were tempted to believe that the world resulted from the efforts and the struggles of many gods. They either rejected the true faith of their patriarchs, or they mixed this truth with the religious beliefs of other nations. In many respects, Moses wrote his account of the primeval times to teach the people of God the way things actually happened. He sought to establish the truth of Yahwism against the falsehoods of other religions. At the same time, Moses accomplished this negative purpose of refuting false myths by interacting positively with the literary traditions of his time. His writings purposefully resembled other ancient Near Eastern writings so that he could communicate God's truth in ways that Israel could understand. Although there are many similarities between Moses' account and several important texts, recent archaeological research has pointed to a dramatic similarity with one particular literary tradition. In 1969, an important document was published under the title Atrahasis, the Babylonian Story of the Flood. Now, we can't be sure of how far back the tradition of this document reaches, but it is important to us because it brings together in one story many pieces which previously had been known only separately. The Atrahasis epic follows a basic threefold structure. It begins with the creation of humanity. The creation of humanity is followed by a record of early human history, which focuses especially on the corruption of the world due to the human race. And then finally, this corruption is rectified by a flood of judgment and a new world order. Comparing Genesis with Atrahasis strongly supports the idea that Moses formed his record with an intentional, overarching structure. At first glance, Genesis 1 through 11 may seem to be a loose collection of passages that move from one topic to another without much continuity. But simply noticing the broad literary parallels with Atrahasis helps us to see that Moses' primeval history holds together as a single storyline with an overarching structure. Genesis chapters 1 through 11 divides into three parts. First, the ideal creation in chapter 1 verse 1 through chapter 2 verse 3. Second, the corruption of the world due to human sin. Genesis chapter 2 verse 4 through chapter 6 verse 8. And then finally, the flood and new order in chapter 6 verse 9 through chapter 11 verse 9.